So now that you have your project set up, we've done our npm installs and we've set up Express, you have basically completed the steps that you will complete every time that you want to begin a new project with this kind of tool set. So what we're going to do now is actually create our Express server that we're going to use for our projects. Then, to test and make sure that everything is set up correctly, we will write our first get method to be sure that we understand how this process works, and it will also test our setup. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new file. And so I'm going to come over here to my window and I'm going to right-click New File, and we're going to call it index.js. So here is our index.js file, and we're going to write a little bit of code that we're going to put into this index.js. And just to explain a little bit why we named it index.js, if you'll think back to that npm setup, it asked us what our entry point file was, and we left it at the default, which is index.js. If you did want to use a different file name, you would specify it during that npm setup. So we're going to write a little code, and I'm going to comment also as I talk to make sure that we understand what we're doing. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to bring in the Express server and create an application. So we do that with, we'll create a let, we'll call it Express. We're going to require Express, and we'll also have app. And that will also equal Express. We're going to need a router object, so we'll use the Express router object. So a router, as you've seen in some of the previous examples, is what helps us point to specific URIs that we're going to be using inside of our API. We're going to create a get to return a list of, let's see, what do we want to list? Let's list all cities. I'm just making up an example here as we go to demonstrate some of the things that we've talked about so far. So we're going to get using the slash, which indicates that root node. Then we're going to point this to a function. And then what do we want to send? Let's pick a city. Let's say Boston. I'm just going to pick a bunch of American cities that you may or may not be familiar with. And then we're going to configure the router so all routes are prefixed with, and let's do API version 1. And this can be important, single quotes here, as we write our APIs to make sure that we understand where our information is coming from. And I see that I made a typo, rec res next here. And so I mentioned that when we use the slash like this, we're basically communicating that we want the root. So if someone comes directly into our API, maybe they're trying to look for backdoors, right? Maybe they're trying to just explore our URIs in our website, or maybe they've typoed something. If they come at it directly, then we want to make sure that they get this particular function. And all of these functions that you're going to write on the router, they typically have this request, response, and a next. And a next is generally what you'll use for like middleware type response handling. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense yet. We will get there. So you can see in here what we've done is set up that response to send some text, which is just Boston. And this is probably the most simplistic thing that our function would be able to do is just send some text. But later we'll look at how would we send other things, but this is just our first example. So then, as I mentioned, using the app.use, the use just allows us to add on to that router request. And so in the case of our Express server, maybe you're running on localhost, you've picked a port number like 5000. And so instead of localhost port 5000 being the root directory for all of these API calls, we're adding and appending to that a /API so that all of those requests will come to that specific URI. And again, sometimes we want to do this to be able to configure our URIs to look all a specific way, or we want to version them all a specific way, and that may be important for your business use. So we can use that app.use to append that information. Okay, so we have one more step that we want to add in here. And so we're going to create the server to listen on a port. And I mentioned 5000, so let's say on port 5000. And so we'll create a var server app.listen, the port number, and then create a function. And we'll just do a console log right? Easy statement. Node server running on localhost 5000. So this listen is important because otherwise the server won't understand or won't be able to function properly to know where it should be receiving requests. So we set up this listen on the particular port that we're going to be using. Now I did create this into a variable because sometimes there are things that we want to be able to do and other configurations we want to be able to make on the server, but for the purposes of our example today, we won't be doing those. So at this point you can save and you've created your Express server. Now we're going to test and make sure that everything is working as expected. To do that, we'll come over to our File Explorer and we're going to open our package.json. Then underneath the scripts section, we're going to add a new section. You can see here there's already one for test. Now we're going to add one for start. So the start script is what is going to be fired essentially when we use the command npm start, which is how we would start our application and let the server know that we're ready to run what we've created. And so instead of letting that just be the default, we're going to tell nodemon to run our index.js file. And remember, we're using nodemon instead of node because if we change something, we want it to dynamically update. Nodemon is just going to sit in the background, monitor for changes, recompile and reissue if we do make any modifications. So if we found an error or something that we want to review, then we won't have to stop, correct, and go through the process again. Nodemon kind of gives us an easier way of going through that process when we're changing, debugging, troubleshooting, whatever we might be doing with our application. So make sure you've saved your package.json and your index.js. There's usually a white bubble to the side if the file is not saved. And if you don't have that terminal window still open, go ahead and open a terminal window, but we're going to use the command npm start. Upon success, which is hopefully what all of us received, you should see that nodemon is reporting that the server is running, it is listening, it is waiting for connections, and here is that console log statement that we wrote out to show us what has happened. So next, we're going to hop over to Postman. Remember, this is one of those tools that I asked you to install. And Postman is a great API development tool that lets us really dig into and evaluate what's going on with our APIs. And so you can see that I'm here on my workspace. If you're not familiar with Postman, then what we're going to do is we're going to click New. and we're going to create a new request. And so if you want to give this a name, I'm going to name it First Try. You can give it a description, and you can decide where to save it. So I chose samples, and we'll save to samples. So up here in the enter request URL, we're going to put in the URL where we expect our request to be, our server to be listening. So that's localhost 5000/API. So make sure this is get. It should be get by default, and we'll click send. And so what should happen is we should see that textual response that we get back from our function. So if you see Boston, then your server is set up, it's listening for requests, then Postman was able to connect to the location, send that request, and get back a response. So before we wrap up, one of the things I want to point out is why we're using Node Monitor. So if I come in here to my function and I change this from Boston to, let's say, New York, and I save that, you see automatically when I saved, NodeMon went ahead and updated that for me. And if I come back over to Postman and click send, I should now see New York as that response. So at this point, you're all set up and ready for further